Okay, thank you for joining me with this presentation. The title of my presentation is the same as my papers, Journeying in the Realm of the Unconscious, Carl Jung's Liber Novus and the Psychedelic Experience. So I will walk you through some of Jung's works and especially focusing on the Red Book, seeing about its importance for the ongoing discussion on altered states of consciousness. So for those of you who are not familiar with Carl Jung, he was a Swiss psychiatrist born in 1875 in Kesswil, Switzerland. His father was a minister. He was very influenced by Christianity in his early life, although came to later reject his father's ideas of Christianity and viewed him as, in a way, a victim of his faith. But these certain elements of Christianity, especially Gnosticism, became very important for Jung's later thinking. So he's a very important thinker from the 20th century. Jung is especially remembered for his work on dreams. He is known to have analyzed over 80,000 dreams in his lifetime. And also otherwise he focused on deciphering other unconscious functions of the psyche. And you might also know Jung through concepts such as the shadow, archetype, collective unconscious, synchronicity, anima, and animus. And what many people don't know about Jung is that he also implemented much of his knowledge of esoteric traditions to his theory. So Jung was very influenced, as mentioned, by Gnosticism, very much like somebody like William Blake. And later on in his life, he was fascinated with alchemy, and his psychology was always intertwined with these different traditions from Western cultural history. So the reason why we're talking about Jung today and why I think his work is so timely is because of the Red Book. And Red Book is basically Jung's magnum opus that remained unpublished in his lifetime and only became available for English audience in 2009. And the associated notebooks became available 2020. So Jung believed that there was something about these works that he did not dare to publish them in his lifetime, but apparently it is time now for us to start to understand their importance for Jung's life and also for his later works. So in order to understand what the Red Book is, we have to go back to the year 1912. At this point in time, Jung was already very well established in his profession. He had a family, a very wealthy wife, and he was in a secure place in his life in many ways. However, at this point, Jung became very a little bit destabilized in his life. His collaboration with Sigmund Freud, which had lasted for a number of years, became to an end, and Jung withdrew from professional life. He retired his position at Bergholzi Hospital and started a private practice at his home. And around this time, Jung became tormented by visions, and one of his most powerful visions happened on a train journey to Schaffhausen in 1913. And in this vision, he saw Europe drowning in blood. And this vision was followed by other visions as well as very significant dreams. And Jung himself, he could not quite grasp what was the purpose of these visions. And as a matter of fact, he thought that he was going crazy. And the records from that time really tell that it was very, very turbulent time for Jung and his family, because Jung really felt that he might just go over the edge. However, when the World War I broke out in 1914, July 28th, Jung realized that actually these visions he had been having dealt with the collective situation of Europe, and they were not just his personal torment. And it was a kind of a relief for him, because he realized that actually they were messages from the unconscious, something that he needed to attend to. So from there, Jung began what later became to be known as the confrontation with the unconscious. So essentially, what he started to do was that during the days he would be holding his private practice, engaging with his family, and then at nights he would go into his study and go into these states in which he allowed his unconscious completely overwhelm him. And he later called this technique active imagination. So what the Red Book is, it's Jung's attempt to go inwards, to find connection with something that he called his soul. He felt that the modern times and this scientific, rational mentality had torn him away from certain kind of inner wisdom. And this was also his private attempt to unite with something that would, well, later bring kind of wholeness to his personality. And although Jung did not have these texts, first the notebooks, the black books, to which he initially wrote everything down, and then the red book, which he worked on for 17 years in total. It's quite obvious that Jung was planning to have them published at some point, from the amount of effort that he actually spent on, transcribing these texts in Latin and German calligraphy, and additionally painting these vivid images in. So the Red Book is essentially kind of an honoring for his imagination. He found a way to actually take these individual experiences and transform them something like an artistic expression that actually has lasting value. So when you read the Red Book, it is a very, very obscure text, and it's written in a completely different style than any of other Jung's works. So I think it's a very baffling experience to just engage with the text and the images. But there is something about this, particularly about its obscurity, that is so compelling. And Jung himself, in the story, he comes to counter this spirit of the depths, which he contrasts to something called the spirit of the times. And the spirit of the depths essentially represents this archaic, primordial wisdom that does not care about the spirit of the times, which are the things that of value and merit that are important for that time. So the spirit of the depths basically asks Jung to completely abandon his reason and the things that he believes to be of importance in that time. And only when Jung does that, he is actually given further access to these powerful images. In this caption, he writes, "The spirit of the depths took my understanding and all my knowledge and placed them at the service of the inexplicable and the paradoxical. He robbed me of speech and writing for everything that was not in his service, namely the melting together of sense and nonsense, which produces the supreme meaning." So in many ways, this quest of the Red Book for Jung was a battle between his sanity, because as a psychiatrist, he clearly regarded himself as somebody who was well grounded, but then at the same time, he was so overwhelmed by this dense mythological and esoteric symbolism that would come to him. And as a matter of fact, his soul even asked him to accept this part of him, to accept his madness. And this is the very important element which became foundational for Jung's later psychology, because Jung began to understand that the presence of certain pathological, certain visions was not necessarily pathological, but it could also play a part in healing. And later on, Jung regarded this time period as the most important time for his life, that created the foundation for all of his later works, which is yet another indicator of why we should look at the Red Book very carefully, especially when we are evaluating Jung's later works. So then, looking at a little bit, how did this actually form Jung's later theory? Well, regarding Jung's outlook of altered states of consciousness, well, he began to understand that his pursuit was something that did not only play a role for himself. And I think that's something that is very specific about the Red Book, that even though it is Jung's personal journey, he very much felt like he was a representative of the individual of that time, and that he was kind of a guinea pig for a certain experiment which could frame a path for a future psychology. And as Jung learned more about the unconscious through these images and through working with these symbolic images, he realized that it was more of a collaboration rather than confrontation. And in this quotation, I think he puts it very interestingly, because he says that he, as a psychiatrist, should at almost every step of his experiment run into the same psychic material, which is the stuff of psychosis and found in the insane. However, Jung around this time came to realize that these images that came to him represented an archaic modality of consciousness which had been lost in the modern era, and that he, even as somebody who considered himself to know the human soul, was not in touch with this particular element, the collective unconscious. And that formed the foundation for his theory. So in this topography of the psyche, you can see how Jung later began to graph his psychology. So he viewed the personal unconscious as the surface level for the psyche, and collective unconscious was this much larger and vaster pool of images that all of us were connected to. It was the land of archetypes. Jung later came to form theories of archetypes. Here is only named a few, so Great Mother, the hero, the cosmic child, but also Jung dealt with archetypes, seeing them as much more fluid images, but not as something that could be directly observed. And in this image, you can also see these small ball, the nuclei of the self, which Jung considered to be the goal of the process of individuation, the wholeness of personality. And he realized that only through this continuous exchange between the conscious and the unconscious, one could gradually process towards the self. But the self was also not something that would represent a perfected personality. It was not like a goal, it was not a goal that could be attained. Rather, it represented a person who would know aspects of themselves which people would usually not seek out, because, and searching for wisdom of the unconscious required confrontation with one's shadow. So these elements of oneself in one's personal unconscious and in the collective unconscious that could also cause great discomfort. So Jung really, he focused a lot on the on articulating this relationship between conscious personality and the unconscious. And in this particular letter, he touches upon it in a very interesting way. He says that the unconscious, you can trust it as if it were your loving father, but at the same time it's nature and it cannot be made use of as if it were a reliable human being, arguing that the unconscious has its own particular logic, its own ways of functioning that don't necessarily adhere to the ways in which we reason. He also says nature is an incomparable guide if you know how to follow her. However, he warns against taking the unconscious literally. And this is where we get to some very interesting observations of his, because he continues to warn against this particular aspect of taking the unconscious literally. So here we come to his essay that he wrote in 1916, The Transcendent Function. And this actually is an essay that remained unpublished for 40 years and was then discovered by some of Jung's students. In this essay, Jung outlines this method, so the active imagination, through which he accessed the unconscious. And he also argues that it is actually necessary to bring up this stuff from the unconscious, because it's much more dangerous to have the unconscious lie in the hidden. That's when it manifests in ways which are completely unexpected and even dangerous. However, he argues that the unconscious can also act in ways which can be very unexpected and even hazardous for the conscious personality. So from here we come to a very interesting dialogue that Jung had, well, over the course of many, many years between the Harvard psychonauts. So Jung wrote an initial foreword for the Tibetan Book of the Dead in 1938, for the English one. And in this foreword, he acknowledges that this Tibetan funerary ritual, which had just become known in the West, represents the life of the unconscious. However, he, in a way, warns against taking it literally, because, well, he was a very cautious guy, and he also saw that the Westerners in their enthusiasm could be easily misguided. However, what's very interesting is that in 1964, when this very famous guidebook for psychedelic experiences was written by Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Richard Alpert, now known as Ram Dass, they actually argued against Jung, and they said that his experience was simply lacking and he did not really understand what was going on, and therefore his opinion maybe doesn't weigh as much. So basically they dismissed his outlook because he had no experience with psychedelics. However, we now know that Jung had very profound understanding of the unconscious and spent a great deal of time on understanding ways in which we can benefit from different altered states of consciousness. However, his approach was certainly more cautionary, because he did not see the benefit of completely losing one's ego in the experience. Rather, he saw this gradual process of introspection as being far more important. And the reason why he also advised against this quick adoption of different traditions and running along with expansive experiences was because he believed that when the experience was so powerful, the ego could basically mistake themselves for the experience and therefore become inflated. And this could lead to kind of a self-trickery, to becoming deceived by the unconscious. So he also believed that the unconscious had this capacity to be a little bit deceptive. And again, this would be the result of literal interpretation. In some other writings of Jung, he, well, this is on just Eastern wisdom. I mean, Jung also warned people against practicing too much yoga, so that part of it can be seen as him being maybe just very traditional and not really wanting to advance with the times. But at the same time, I think we have to distinguish the good bits and his genuine wisdom regarding the unconscious. So in this tract, he, for instance, says that if the wrong man uses the right means work in the wrong way, and also that in reality everything depends on the man and little or nothing on the method, and that the method is merely the path, the direction taken by a man. The way he acts is the true expression of his nature. The reason why Jung was writing in this way was because he simply believed in taking responsibility. And in one of his comments regarding psychedelics, as mentioned, he wasn't too keen on their use. He argues that the more one knows about the collective unconscious, the greater and heavier becomes their responsibility, and therefore everybody should have this great caution towards these matters. So I think there is so much we can take from Jung regarding his outlook and regarding the way in which he integrated his own experiences, because clearly he was somebody who had a deep reverence for the powers of the unconscious, and also a very fruitful way of working with his own experiences through this artistic expression. So there's just a few takeaways from Jung's life that we can take. Basically, he really believed that we needed this connection with the collective unconscious, and this is why he focused so deeply on dreams. He also believed that our psyche has this certain self-regulatory capacity, so that we will be given signs from the unconscious when it is time for it. Yet he also believed that prompting the unconscious can also be useful. It can be useful to go into certain altered states with intention if one has the required groundedness and the willingness to spend time on integrating these experiences. And he saw that this lifelong journey of working with dreams and intuition was the most important way for doing so. And the way and the actual method which he used throughout his life was working with symbols. So as we have spoken so much about Jung's outlook on psychedelics, I think it's also interesting to mention that even though he supposedly did not experiment with them and actually was quite opposed to their use, excuse me, there is some indication that he may have changed his opinion about psychedelics at the very end of his life. And this is just a small quotation from Michael Fordham's book, Freud, Jung, Klein, The Fenceless Field, Essays on Psychoanalysis and Analytical Psychology. And basically, Michael Fordham, who himself was actually opposed to psychoactive substances, mentions that only a couple of days before his death, Jung was talking to him about LSD and its capacity to bring into consciousness these unconscious images. So I mean, we will never know whether Jung actually changed his mind, but at least there is a possibility of it. And perhaps because he understood that the way in which modernity was going, and that there was this increasing disconnection between our natural way of being in the world and our sort of increasing technological and scientific advancement also that influenced the individual. Maybe he had an intuition that it was going to be increasingly difficult to find a kind of peace and solitude that allowed us to engage with the unconscious through the means that he mostly promoted. So dreams and intuitions. And then therefore he maybe would have suspected that using some kinds of tools such as psychedelics could have actually been beneficial. So as the final takeaway, I think what Jung essentially emphasized in his work was understanding symbols and being able to work with them. And his final book, Man and His Symbols, was his attempt to formulate this particular thesis, because he realized that as we were becoming people living in an age where we had no connection with religious symbols, that would also decrease our ability to understand the language of the unconscious, and that therefore learning about our own particular symbolic frameworks was the essential task. And this is where I will end this presentation. Thank you for being with me and listening, and I wish you all a great conference from our homes.